In 1975, the New York was so close to bankruptcy that President Gerald Ford refused a federal bailout. The Daily News ran a headline that has lived in American memory ever since. Ford to city, drop dead. The city's finances were so far gone that sanitation workers went on strike and garbage piled up in the streets. Police force cut by 6,000. Firefighters cut by 2,500. Firehouses in the South Bronx closed to save money, which is how the South Bronx started burning. Between 1970 and 1980, the South Bronx lost over 600 buildings to fire. Many of them were set deliberately by landlords collecting insurance on property that had become worthless. When Game 2 of the 1977 World Series was played at Yankee Stadium, a building was burning in plain view of the ABC cameras covering the game. That image, the Bronx is burning, while Yankee Stadium lit up a few blocks away, is the single most accurate visual document of what New York in the 1970s actually was. 1976 saw the largest spike in reported felonies in the city's recorded history, 13.2% in a single year. The subway had become what tabloids called the Muggers Express. Travelers arriving at city airports were handed pamphlets titled, "Welcome to Fear City," a death's head on the cover, warning them to stay off streets after dark and avoid public transportation entirely. And in the summer of 1977, Son of Sam was still hunting. David Berkowitz shooting couples in parked cars across the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens, sending letters to the police that the newspapers printed in full. New York that summer was running at a specific frequency of collective fear that residents who lived through it describe as unlike anything before or since. Into that city rode the motorcyclists, not to glamorize it, not to pose. Because when the city is falling apart around you and the machine is the fastest way through it, the machine stops being a lifestyle and starts being a tool. That distinction is everything. California built beautiful machines, long forks, low frames, designed for straight roads and good light with time to appreciate them. New York required something completely different. The men who figured out what that something was produced one of the original engineering arguments in the history of the American custom motorcycle. Lawrence Desmedy had been riding since he was 15 in Cornwall-on-Hudson, up the Hudson Valley. He moved to New York City, Greenwich Village specifically, because the late 1960s art scene was running at full temperature and he wanted to be part of the most alive place in America. He was a fabricator. He had a talent that nobody had formally identified yet, including him. He had 35 arrests by the time anyone started paying attention, and he did 3 years in Sing Sing for bank robbery in 1972 before coming back to New York and picking up the machines again. What DeSmet understood about riding in the city, and he understood it the way you understand things that the environment teaches you through consequences, was that the California aesthetic could not function here. The long fork chopper that looked perfect on a California highway was a problem on East 3rd Street. Too wide to split gridlock. Too slow responding to react to the pothole that appeared from behind the car in front with no warning. Too impractical for a city that changed its road surface every block and its traffic logic every intersection. The machine New York required was narrow enough to split a gap between a cab and a bus at speed. Responsive enough to react instantly to whatever the road threw at you. Loud enough that the delivery truck driver who had not checked his mirror would hear you before he moved. The New York chopper that DeSmet developed was built for urban combat. Not for show. Not for the rock store on a Sunday morning. For survival in concrete and chaos. He rebuilt motors out of his apartment. Because in New York, a young man with no money does not have a garage in San Leandro, he has an apartment floor. He worked in motorcycle shops in Manhattan and New Jersey. He built in whatever space was available. Every decision had to be correct because there was no margin for error that money could fix. By the time Iron Horse magazine ran the first feature on him in 1987, his chopped 1950 Indian chief, red-orange flames on one side of the tank, scallops on the other, people had been calling him Indian Larry for years. Not because of a marketing campaign, because he rode his chopped Indian ceaselessly through the streets of New York City, and the machine was good enough that people remembered it. Robert Mapplethorpe photographed him, One of those photographs ended up on the cover of Artforum magazine. Andy Warhol's circle and the East Village motorcycle world intersected in ways that do not exist anywhere else in American motorcycle history. That is not something you build by design. That is what happens when genuine talent operates in the most densely talented city in the world with no resources except the machine and the hands that understand it. On December 5, 1969, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club patched over the Aliens MC in New York City and established their first New York chapter. The address was 77 East 3rd Street in the East Village. That address is still there today. By the mid-1970s, the New York chapter had become one of the most powerful in the country. Not a California transplant, a conversion. An existing New York club choosing to align with the most feared motorcycle organization in the world, and then becoming something the California chapters had not anticipated: the Eastern Command Center for operations up and down the Atlantic seaboard. The clubhouse on East 3rd Street was not in an industrial zone, not on a warehouse road, on a residential street in the East Village, 20 feet from the pizza place and the laundromat, in a neighborhood where people lived and children went to school. That geographic reality shaped everything. California's outlaw culture operated at the scale of the landscape, vast territory, room to operate. New York compressed everything into a single block. The Angels on East 3rd Street shared the same spatial reality as everyone else. That tension between the club's self-image as outside society and the physical fact of being on a residential street produced something no California chapter had to navigate. The biker war that would rage for decades was ignited not on some California road, but at a party in the East Village on New Year's Eve 1973. 3 outlaws from Florida showed up uninvited at the Hells Angels headquarters. What followed from that night, machine gun attacks on outlaws' clubhouses in Georgia, Florida, and Ohio through 1974 and 1975, was the outlaw motorcycle war the California mythology had been building toward for 20 years. It started in New York. Here is the New York motorcycle story that appears in almost no magazine from the 1970s. Ride the FDR Drive today, the elevated highway along the east side of Manhattan, and you are on the same road where black motorcycle clubs from the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens would fill all 3 lanes in formation. Not 1 or 2 bikes, all 3 lanes. The exhaust note of a formation that size hitting the buildings on both sides as something between music and weather. These clubs are documented in the photography book Easy Riders, which captured the community decades later. But the clubs themselves go back further than any photography. The Bronx had the Black Falcons. Brooklyn had its own network. Queens had its own. Built around principles that riders across the country were developing simultaneously, often without knowing each other existed. Employment, family, mechanical knowledge. The motorcycle, as the center of a community rather than a performance of identity. The archetype of the American motorcycle rider had been built, in the press and in the films, as a white man on the open road. Black Americans were just as deep in motorcycle history. Ben Hardy and Cliff Voss, black designers in South Central Los Angeles, had built the Captain America and Billy bikes for Easy Rider in 1969, the most famous motorcycles in American film history. Both men were written out of the credits. Voggs's settlement with Columbia Pictures included a clause deleting him from the film entirely. That deletion was not an accident, it was a pattern. And the New York black motorcycle clubs of the 1970s were part of the same pattern, building something real, building it well, and having mainstream America look the other way while doing it. The FDR formation rides were not symbolic. They were territorial. They were a statement of presence in a city that had been telling those riders, through housing policy and economic policy, that the city's space was not theirs. Filling all 3 lanes of a Manhattan highway in formation said something that no press release and no political campaign could say. The chrome in the exhaust and the number of riders said it plainly: we are here and we are not invisible. On February 9, 1979, Paramount Pictures released The Warriors. It was filmed entirely on location in New York City, subway stations, parks, streets. A Coney Island gang fought its way home from the Bronx after being framed for murdering the most powerful warlord in the city. The film is not realistic, Walter Hill said so himself, but it is accurate. The atmosphere, a city that operated by its own rules after midnight, where every neighborhood was its own territory with its own logic, where the violence was territorial and comprehensible to anyone who understood the map, matches exactly what riders and residents who lived in that city describe from those years. The only motorcycle gang in the Warriors was the Satan's Mothers from Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn. They arrive at the film's opening summit in Van Cortlandt Park in formation, wearing leather vests. The visual weight of an organization rather than a collection of individuals. They are not the main characters, they are the background texture that tells you what kind of city this is. Now compare that to Chips. Eric Estrada and Larry Wilcox rode Kawasaki KZ900 police bikes, chasing criminals up clean Los Angeles freeways in 72-degree sunshine. The California version of the motorcycle on television was the Highway Patrol, Professional, Legal, the Heroes. The New York version was the Satan's Mothers from Sheepshead Bay. Nobody's heroes, not the law. Something else entirely. Both were accurate representations of what motorcycle culture actually was in those two cities. California produced an image mainstream America could admire. New York produced an image mainstream America could not look away from. Those are different kinds of power, and I personally think the one that grabs you and won't let go is more honest about what motorcycles meant to the people who actually rode them. The summer of 1977 is the year that captures everything about what New York motorcycle culture was in this decade. July 13th, 1977, the city blackout. A lightning strike at a Con Edison plant, cascading failures, all 5 boroughs go dark simultaneously. Within hours, looting begins in Bushwick, the South Bronx, Crown Heights, Harlem. By the time power was restored, 1,616 stores had been damaged or looted. 3,776 people arrested, the largest mass arrest in the city's history. Son of Sam was still at large. He would not be caught until August 10th. The summer of 1977 in New York, the heat, the blackout, the murders, the Bronx fire still visible from the highway, exists as a specific, documented, collective trauma in the memory of everyone who lived through it. Motorcycle culture thrived in that vacuum. When police presence thinned and municipal services collapsed, riders created their own order. Clubs operated on a different level from the street gangs that controlled abandoned neighborhoods. Organized. Structured. Their own codes, not just riding motorcycles, staking claims in a city that had given up on itself, building communities where government had failed, creating families from fragments of broken dreams. And then October 18th, 1977. Reggie Jackson hit 3 home runs in Game 6 of the World Series on 3 consecutive pitches from 3 different pitchers. The Yankees won. The city that had been collapsing for a decade got a championship. The Bronx was still burning. Son of Sam had been arrested 2 months earlier. The garbage had been picked up eventually, and the motorcycles were still roaring through it all, not because the city had fixed itself, but because the riders had decided the city was theirs regardless of what condition it was in. That decision, to claim a city that was falling apart, to move through it daily on a machine you built and understood completely, to refuse the premise that the environment determined what was possible, is the core of what 1970s New York motorcycle culture actually was. California riders had the Pacific Coast Highway. New York riders had something the California mythology never explains. One of the best day ride landscapes in the eastern United States. 45 minutes from the city if the traffic was light. Cross the George Washington Bridge heading west, and you are on the Palisades Parkway in minutes. The basalt cliffs rising from the Hudson's western shore. A 2-lane parkway running north along the top of them, no trucks permitted. The river visible through the trees when the leaves are down. The road curving with a rhythm that rewards attention. 45 minutes further is Bear Mountain State Park. Perkins Memorial Drive, climbing up the mountain. The long curves around the lake. The descent back toward the Hudson. In the 1970s, before organized weekend ride culture developed around it, Bear Mountain was where New York riders went to remember what the machine was capable of beyond the city streets. The contrast is specific to New York and does not exist anywhere else in American motorcycle history. A rider in Los Angeles going from the city to the canyons was still in Los Angeles, spread across a landscape that always provided visual space. A New York writer who lived 11 months of the year in the most vertical, most compressed, most aggressively urban environment in the country, and then crossed the George Washington Bridge into the Palisades, entered a landscape that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never heard of Manhattan. That writer knew both environments. Had to. The machine that worked on East 3rd Street needed to work on Bear Mountain in October. The mechanical knowledge that kept you alive in the city applied equally to the mountain. That dual competence is what separated the New York version of the 1970s writer from every other regional version. Not just skill in one environment, but the ability to read two completely different sets of conditions with the same machine and the same understanding. The dual competence those writers developed, city streets one weekend, Bear Mountain the next, the same machine serving both environments because you understand every system, is what the current market has been training writers out of for 40 years. The 2026 Motorcycle Buyer's Bible is the document for the writer who wants to be back on the right side of that. Independent tire data. Gear certification that tells you what the numbers actually mean. Pre-purchase inspection protocol for bikes that have been sitting. Dealer scripts that work in the market we are actually in. It was $97, it is $9 right now. Not because the information is worth less, because I want writers to have it. Link in the description. Indian Larry got his first national exposure in 2001 on the Discovery Channel. He was 52 years old. He had been building extraordinary machines for 30 years before anyone with a platform pointed a camera at him. In July 2004, he told the Discovery Channel, "I just feel like that I'm maybe slightly starting to fit in somewhere and slightly starting to be accepted." He died 6 weeks later. August 30, 2004, a stunt at the Liquid Steel Classic in Charlotte, North Carolina. He fell from his moving motorcycle. The head injuries were unsurvivable. Think about the arc of that. 30 years building in New York. Apartment floors. Borrowed shop space. Motorcycle shops in Manhattan and New Jersey. 35 arrests. 3 years in Sing Sing. Robert Mapplethorpe photographing him. Cover of Art Forum. Andy Warhol's circle. And his first words when the Discovery Channel finally found him at 52 were, "I am maybe slightly starting to fit in." California's custom builders, the ones whose names appear in every history of the era, were recognized for decades before they died. The infrastructure of California's motorcycle culture, with its show circuit and its magazine coverage and its geography designed for visibility, produced careers that had institutional support from the beginning. Indian Larry built his career in a city that was not designed for the kind of work he was doing, in conditions that punished everything about the process of building, space, cost, weather, access to materials, relationship with the press, relationship with the institutional motorcycle world. He built it on instinct. His shop partner Paul Cox said he never made a sketch, never wrote down notes. He would just see the whole bike in one wide-eyed flash and start cutting metal. That is what the New York motorcycle culture produced. Not the most celebrated, not the most covered, the most real. By the late 1970s, the conditions that had made this culture were changing. The fiscal crisis stabilized. Crime remained high, but the sense of complete collapse began to fade. Mayor Ed Koch brought fiscal conservatism and gradual order. The extreme choppers that had defined the visual language of the decade, forks stretched to angles that made the machine genuinely difficult to ride, frames so low the exhaust scraped on every turn, began to give way to machines that were also practical. Disc brakes, electric starters, suspension that worked. The Japanese manufacturers had created the universal motorcycle, machines that did not demand anything of their riders beyond the ability to operate them. You did not need to understand the Honda CB750 to keep it running. You needed to ride it. That distinction sounds small. It changed everything. When the machine stops requiring understanding, the culture stops selecting for people who understand things. And when a culture stops selecting for competence, it starts selecting for something else. In New York's case, it started selecting for the people who could afford the new image. The writers who had built the culture on apartment floors and borrowed shop space and 35 arrests and a Sing Sing number, those writers did not disappear. But the industry stopped producing machines for them and started producing machines for people with more money and fewer Sing Sing numbers. The culture that had been built on survival in the most demanding urban environment in America became, gradually, a consumer product. The energy that had produced the FDR formation rides and the East 3rd Street Clubhouse and Indian Larry's instinct-driven fabrication did not vanish. It went underground, into garages that are still running today, into riders who understand their machines the way the city once required everyone to understand them. Those riders do not get the coverage. The industry is not particularly interested in promoting the idea that you do not need them to be a real rider. The close. I drive a 2000 Ford Ranger with 340,000 miles on it. I paid cash. I understand every system on it. It has never failed to start in 26 years because I have never given it reason to. The New York riders of the 1970s understood their machines the way the city required, completely, under conditions that punished any gap in that understanding immediately. There was no margin. The road changed every block, the traffic had no predictable logic, the machine that failed on the FDR in January had nobody coming to help it. What those riders built, Lawrence D. Smet threading a chopped Indian through Manhattan traffic 35 years before the Discovery Channel found him, the black clubs filling all 3 lanes of the FDR in formation, while mainstream motorcycle press looked at California, the New Year's Eve 1973, party that started a war, Reggie Jackson hitting 3 home runs, while the Bronx burned 2 miles away, that is, the 1970s New York motorcycle story. It is not the story the magazines told, it is not the story the documentaries make. It is the story the city produced when it had nothing left to offer the people who stayed, except the machine, and the roads, and the specific education that comes from riding in conditions that do not forgive. Pennsylvania is next in this series. Coal country. Steel towns. The industrial riders who built machines in the shadow of the factories that built the engines that built America. The Appalachian roads that opened up 50 miles outside Pittsburgh. The culture nobody is told, and I mean nobody. The 2026 Motorcycle Buyer's Bible is in the description. It was $97 when I launched it. It is $9 right now. Everything I just described, the independent tire data, the gear certification breakdown, the dealer scripts, the pre-purchase inspection protocol for the market we are in. $9. Link below. That is the last time I mention it. If you rode in New York in the 1970s, your burro, your bike, the road. Drop it in the comments. The best stories show up in the Pennsylvania episode. Stay safe. Ride smart.